On the night she became queen, Elara Whitmore learned what it meant to be alone. Not the quiet kind. The kind that carved you open from the inside while a palace full of people pretended not to notice. Because here's the truth about power. It doesn't care who it destroys, only who's left standing when the dust clears. And tonight, standing in a foreign bedchamber, in a wedding gown that cost more than most families see in a lifetime, Elara Whitmore was about to learn exactly what she'd traded her freedom for. So buckle up, because this story gets darker before it gets light. If you're watching this from your corner of the world, drop your city name in the comments and hit that like button. Let me know my tribe is out there, because we're going deep into the kind of betrayal that doesn't just break hearts. It shatters empires. The ceremonial candles had burned down to nubs by the time Elara stood alone in the royal chamber. Outside the latticed windows, the capital city of Valacrest sprawled in celebration, torches and bonfires painting the night in shades of copper and gold. Music still drifted up from the lower courtyards, strings and drums beating out the rhythm of a kingdom that had just secured its future through marriage. They thought they had, anyway. Elara's fingers worked at the clasps of her ceremonial collar, the metal cold against her throat despite hours of wear. The thing weighed more than it looked, platinum inlaid with sapphires the size of knuckle bones, each one representing a province of the empire. 7 stones. 7 territories. All of them now supposedly hers to call home, though she'd been born in none of them. The clasps wouldn't give. Her fingers, steady through 6 hours of ceremony and receiving lines and forced smiles, now trembled with exhaustion. Or maybe it was something else. Something that had been building since the moment King Adrian Vale had placed his hand over hers during the vows, and she'd felt nothing. Not warmth, not reassurance, just the cool press of obligation wrapped in flesh. She'd known what this was. Her father, Lord Carrick Whitmore, had been clear as spring water when he'd laid out the arrangement 3 months ago in their estate's war room. The Whitmore lands bordered the contested territories to the east. The Vale Empire needed stability. Adrian needed a bride whose family brought strategic advantage and enough noble blood to satisfy the old houses. Elara needed to do her duty. Love was never part of the negotiation. But abandonment on her wedding night hadn't been in the terms either. Elara finally got the collar off and set it on the dressing table with more force than necessary. The sapphires caught the candlelight and threw it back at her in fractured blue sparks. Pretty chains were still chains. Her mother had told her that once, years ago, back when her mother was still alive and still willing to speak truths that made powerful men uncomfortable. The chamber door stood closed. Locked from the outside, she'd discovered an hour ago when she'd tried it. Not imprisoned, exactly, but not free to wander the palace halls on her first night as queen. For your protection, the head of household guard had said when he'd escorted her here after the feast, until His Majesty returns. Returns from where, she'd wanted to ask. But queens didn't ask questions in public, not if they wanted to last. She'd counted the stones in the floor, 263 pale granite squares between the door and the bed. The bed itself was a monstrosity, carved oak posts thick as a man's torso, draped in crimson silk that probably cost more than her father spent on his entire household guard for a year. It dominated the room like a beast waiting to be fed. She'd been avoiding looking at it directly. Elara moved to the window instead. The glass was old, hand-blown, slightly warped so the fires below seemed to dance and bend. She pressed her palm against it, cool to the touch despite the summer night. Below, she could make out the shapes of revelers still celebrating in the streets. They'd been given wine from the royal cellars, free bread from the palace ovens. A king's wedding was the people's holiday, even if the king himself had disappeared before the bedding ceremony could begin. They'd waited for him. An hour, while Elara sat in this room surrounded by tittering ladies-in-waiting who'd been assigned to her by the royal household. Women she didn't know, wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes, all of them pretending this was normal. That it was perfectly acceptable for a groom to vanish on his wedding night while his bride sat in her ceremonial silk like a doll waiting to be played with. Finally, the head lady, a steel-spined woman named Margot, with silver shot through her black hair, had dismissed the others. Then she'd looked at Elara with something that might have been pity, if pity wasn't beneath a woman of her station. "You should rest," Lady Margot had said. "Not your Majesty. Not even my queen. Just rest. as if Elara were a child being put to bed after staying up too late. Elara had wanted to scream. She'd smiled instead. Now, alone, she let the smile drop. Her reflection in the window glass looked back at her, dark hair still pinned in the elaborate braids the royal hairdressers had woven that morning, eyes underlined with kohl in the Eastern style that was fashionable at court, skin pale, not from powder, but from the slow realization that she had made a catastrophic mistake. Not in agreeing to the marriage. She'd had no choice in that. Her father's house was drowning in debt from the border wars. The Vales had offered an alliance that would save the Whitmore name from ruin. Elara's hand in exchange for military support and enough gold to rebuild their burned estates. A transaction. Clean. Understandable. No, the mistake had been in thinking she understood what kind of man Adrian Vale was. She'd met him twice before the wedding. Once at the formal betrothal, where they'd spoken perhaps 20 words to each other, all of them scripted by advisors. Once at a state dinner a month later, where he'd asked her opinion on the wine and then listened to her answer with the same polite attention he'd given the Master of Coins report on tariff revenues. He was handsome in the way powerful men often were, not because of any particular feature, but because power itself made a person attractive. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and darker eyes, and the kind of face that looked equally good stern or smiling. He'd smiled at her exactly once during their courtship. It hadn't reached his eyes then either. She'd told herself it didn't matter. Marriage among their class was business. Affection, if it came later. Her parents had barely known each other when they wed. They'd built something real over time. She could do the same, but her father hadn't disappeared on her mother's wedding night. Elara turned from the window and paced the room. Her wedding gown was still on. White silk shot through with gold thread, so heavy she felt like she was drowning in fabric. She should take it off. Call for a servant to help with the laces. Get into one of the nightgowns that had been laid out on the bed with such careful ceremony earlier in the evening. She didn't move toward the bell pull. Instead, she found herself at Adrian's side of the dressing table. His things were already here. Brushes, a razor, small bottles of oils and tonics. The trappings of a man who lived in this room. Who would live in this room with her, supposedly. Who should have been here now. Elara picked up the razor. Heavy, well-made, the handle inlaid with mother of pearl. She set it down, opened one of the small drawers. Inside was a miniature portrait, the kind men carried as keepsakes. Her breath caught. The woman in the portrait was beautiful, not in Elara's own dark-haired, sharp-featured way, but with the kind of ethereal loveliness that painters idealized and noblemen went to war over. Golden hair, pale skin, eyes like summer sky. She wore simple dress, nothing ornate, but the painter had captured something in her expression, a warmth, an intimacy, that made Elara's stomach turn to ice. This was not a portrait of a sister, or a mother, or any relation a man kept tucked in his private drawer innocently. Elara's hands were shaking again. She closed the drawer, opened another. More portraits, letters tied with ribbon, a lock of golden hair wrapped in silk. She slammed the drawer shut hard enough that bottles rattled. The sound echoed in the silent room. When her breathing steadied, Elara turned and looked at the door. Still closed, still locked from outside, trapping her in here with evidence of her husband's heart belonging to someone else. This was what they'd purchased with their strategic alliance and their gold. A queen's crown and a king's indifference. No, worse than indifference. Indifference would have been kinder. This was active deception, the kind that required planning, required maintaining a whole separate life hidden just out of view. Elara had been raised in a house where power was the only currency that mattered. Her father had taught her to read ledgers before she could properly read poetry, to understand that every alliance was transactional, every relationship strategic. She'd thought she understood the game. She'd been wrong. Because the game wasn't about understanding the transaction. It was about understanding that some things couldn't be bought. And the man she'd just married had spent her family's gold and his kingdom's celebration while his heart was somewhere else entirely. The candles burned lower. The sounds of celebration outside began to fade as the night deepened and even the most dedicated revelers found their way to bed. Elara stood in the center of the room, still in her wedding gown, and felt the weight of the situation settle onto her shoulders like the ceremonial collar she'd just removed. She could scream, could demand answers, could throw the portraits and letters into the fireplace and wait for Adrian to return and confront him with the evidence of his duplicity. But queens didn't scream, not if they wanted to survive. Instead, Elara began to think. She moved to the writing desk tucked in the corner of the room, found paper, ink, a pen. Her hands had stopped shaking. Strange how clarity brought calm. She wasn't writing anything down. Not yet. Just touching the tools, reminding herself that she'd been trained for more than ornamental wifehood. Her father might have been a brutal man, but he'd educated his daughter like he would have educated a son. Strategy, negotiation, the art of appearing weak while sharpening knives in the dark. Elara had knives. She just needed to figure out where to put them. A sound from the corridor made her freeze. Footsteps. Heavy boots on stone. They slowed outside her door. She heard the guard's low voice, then the rasp of the lock turning. Elara moved back to the center of the room, clasped her hands in front of her, arranged her face into careful neutrality. Whatever was coming through that door, she would meet it standing. The door opened. Adrian Vale stepped inside. He looked tired. That was Elara's first thought. His jacket was gone, collar loosened, dark hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. There was mud on his boots, mud on the king's wedding night, like he'd been somewhere that required riding instead of somewhere that required being in his marriage bed. He saw her and stopped. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the expanse of stone floor. 263 squares. Elara had counted. I apologize for the delay, Adrian said finally. His voice was deep, measured, the same tone he'd used when speaking to foreign ambassadors during the feast. Polite, distant, formal as frost. Urgent matters of state required my attention. Elara said nothing, just watched him. Waited. Adrian closed the door behind him. The sound of the lock engaging again was soft but final. He moved into the room, his movements careful, like he was approaching a skittish horse. When he spoke again, his words came slower. I know this is not the evening you anticipated. What evening did I anticipate? Elara asked. Her voice came out steady. Good. She needed steady. What exactly should a bride expect when her groom abandons her on their wedding night? Something flickered in Adrian's expression. Not quite guilt. More like recognition. That she wasn't going to make this easy. That the meek, dutiful daughter her father had presented was not necessarily what he'd married. I had responsibilities, he said. Matters that could not wait. On tonight, Elara said, of all nights, on this specific night, the one night in our lives when responsibility should have dictated you stay. Adrian's jaw tightened. You do not understand the pressures of the crown. Then explain them to me. It was a challenge. They both knew it. Kings did not explain themselves to their wives. Wives accepted, adapted, made do. That was the arrangement. The unspoken terms of every political marriage since nobility began trading daughters for territory. But Elara had just spent 3 hours alone in a room full of evidence that her husband's heart belonged to someone else, and she was done accepting terms she hadn't agreed to. Adrian stared at her. In the candlelight, his face was all angles and shadows. She could see him calculating, weighing how much honesty this situation required versus how little he could offer without causing a scene. There are aspects of governance, he said carefully, that remain confidential even from one's closest advisors. Matters of security that demand discretion. Elara laughed. She couldn't help it. The sound came out sharp and bitter, nothing like the musical laughs she'd been trained to produce at court functions. Security, she said. Is that what we're calling it? Adrian's expression shuddered completely. You would do well to remember your position. My position. Elara took a step toward him. Her wedding gown rustled, all that silk and gold thread whispering like conspirators. My position is the one you left empty tonight while you rode through mud to attend to urgent business that apparently wears silk and has golden hair. The silence that followed was absolute. Adrian's face went very still, not angry, not defensive, just utterly, carefully blank, which told Elara everything she needed to know about whether she was right. You have been going through my things, he said quietly. You left me locked in a room with nothing else to do. Those are private. So was tonight supposed to be. They were close now, close enough that Elara could see the pulse beating in Adrian's throat, could smell leather and horse and night air clinging to him, could see the exact moment he decided whether to deny what she'd found or acknowledge it. He chose acknowledgement, but not apology. "My past is my own," Adrian said. His voice had gone cold, colder than the window glass, colder than the sapphires in her discarded collar. "What came before our arrangement does not concern you." Elara felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. She'd been careful to guard that. But something else. Some last fragile hope that maybe this could have been bearable, that maybe duty and distance could have been survivable if there was at least honesty beneath them. She'd been a fool. "Your past," she said softly, "is currently your present. Tonight. Our wedding night. You chose her over me. I chose nothing over you. We have an arrangement. I have fulfilled my obligations. The marriage is legal. The alliance is secured. What more do you require?" "More than this." The words came out before Elara could stop them. Raw, honest, weak. She hated herself for saying them even as they hung in the air between them. Adrian's expression didn't change. That was worse than anger, worse than defensiveness. His face remained utterly neutral, like she'd just asked him about trade agreements or crop yields. "You require romance," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis, an observation of an inconvenient symptom. "You were told the terms of this marriage. Your father made them clear. This is a political alliance. I need heirs and stability. You bring both. Where my affections lie is irrelevant to that function." Function. He'd called their marriage a function, like she was a mechanism in one of the great clockwork devices that kept the palace fountains running. Insert the noblewoman, turn the key, produce the required heirs, maintain the appearance of unity. Elara turned away from him. If she kept looking at his face, at that careful, controlled blankness, she was going to do something she'd regret. Scream, maybe. Or worse, cry. And she would not give him the satisfaction of either. She walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the last of the bonfires were burning down to embers. The city was going dark, bit by bit. Everyone going home, going to bed, going to their lives that made sense in ways hers no longer did. "I will not be a ghost in my own marriage," she said to her reflection. To the darkness beyond. To Adrian standing somewhere behind her in a room that would now always feel like a cage. "I will not be the decoration you parade at state functions while your real life happens elsewhere." "You will be queen," Adrian said. His voice was closer now. He'd moved up behind her, though not touching. Never touching. "That is not a small thing. It is nothing without respect. Respect is earned. Then I will earn it." Elara turned to face him. He was closer than she'd realized. Close enough to kiss, if this were a different kind of story. If they were different kinds of people. But they weren't. They were two strangers bound by law and politics, and families who'd needed things from each other more than they'd cared about the lives they were bartering. Adrian's dark eyes searched her face, looking for what she didn't know. Compliance, maybe, or proof that she would fold like all the other women in his life probably had, accept her place and stop asking inconvenient questions. He didn't know her very well yet. That would be his mistake. "I leave at dawn," Adrian said finally, stepping back, putting careful distance between them again. "There are matters in the eastern provinces that require my attention. I will be gone a fortnight, perhaps longer. You will have time to settle into the palace, learn its rhythms. The staff will help you. You are leaving again. I am attending to my kingdom. On the morning after our wedding." Adrian's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration, might have been guilt. It passed too quickly to be sure. "The kingdom does not pause for personal convenience," he said. "Surely your father taught you that. My father taught me many things." Elara held his gaze, including that men who do not honor their commitments are weak, regardless of what crown they wear. It was a direct hit. She saw it land in the way Adrian's shoulders stiffened, the way his jaw clenched. For a moment she thought he might actually respond with honest anger, with something real instead of this careful political deflection. Instead, he just nodded once. Sharp, final. "You should rest," he said. "The coronation ceremony for your investiture as queen consort is in 3 days. You will need your strength." "And will you be there?" Elara asked. "Or will urgent state business call you away from that as well?" "I will be there." Adrian moved toward the door. "Until then, the palace is yours to explore. The staff will answer any questions. Lady Margot will guide you in understanding your duties." He was leaving. Actually leaving. not even going to stay in the room he supposedly shared with her. Elara's hands curled into fists in the heavy silk of her skirts. Adrian paused with his hand on the door, looked back at her. For just a second, his careful mask slipped and she saw something underneath. Not affection, not even real regret, just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man carrying more weight than showed. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "that this is not what you hoped for." Then he was gone. The door closed. The lock turned. Elara stood alone in the queen's chamber, in her wedding gown, as the last candles began to gutter and die. She did not cry. Instead, she walked back to Adrian's dressing table, opened the drawer with the portraits and letters, pulled them all out and spread them across the table's surface. Evidence. Proof. The scattered pieces of a puzzle she was going to solve whether her absent husband cooperated or not. Because Adrian had made a mistake tonight. He'd shown her that he was vulnerable, that there was someone he valued more than duty or appearance or political advantage, and anything a person valued that much could be used against them. Elara had been raised in a house where power was the only currency that mattered. She was going to become very, very rich. The golden-haired woman in the portrait smiled up at her from the table. Beautiful, beloved, hidden. Not for much longer. Elara picked up one of the letters. The seal had already been broken. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting inside was elegant, educated, the script of someone who'd been taught by expensive tutors. "My dearest Adrian," it began. Elara started reading. By the time dawn light began to creep through the windows, she'd read them all. Every letter, every note, every scrap of paper that revealed the shape of the king's secret heart. And she'd learned 3 crucial things. The woman's name was Celine Vire. She lived in a manor house 2 hours' ride from the capital. And she was not just Adrian's past love. She was still very much his present. The implications crashed over Elara like a wave. Adrian hadn't just kept old tokens of a dead romance. He was actively maintaining a relationship, writing to her, visiting her. That was where he'd gone tonight, not to urgent state business, to Celine, while his legal wife sat alone in a locked room. Elara's hands trembled as she folded the letters and put them back exactly as she'd found them. Closed the drawer, stood back. The room looked exactly as it had before, no evidence that she'd discovered anything. That was important. She needed Adrian to think she was contained, manageable. The dutiful wife who'd accepted her position. She needed him to underestimate her. Because Elara Whitmore had not survived growing up in her father's house by being weak. She'd survived by being smart, by watching, by learning to read the currents of power and navigate them without drowning. Adrian thought this marriage was about heirs and alliances and maintaining appearances. He was about to learn different. Outside, the palace was beginning to wake. Elara could hear servants in the corridors, the distant sounds of the household machinery starting up. Soon someone would come to help her out of this wedding gown, to dress her in something appropriate for the new queen consort, to begin the careful process of teaching her how to be decorative and silent and convenient. Elara moved to the window, looked out at the waking city, at the empire she'd just been sold into. Somewhere out there, 2 hours ride away, Celine Vire was probably just going to sleep, probably exhausted from entertaining a king on his wedding night, probably very confident in her position as the woman who actually held Adrian's heart. That confidence was going to be her downfall. Elara pressed her palm against the glass. The city spread out below her like a game board, pieces everywhere, waiting to be moved. She just needed to learn the rules, learn who the players were, learn where the real power lived in this palace of smiles and secrets. She had 3 days before her coronation as queen consort. 3 days to transform from abandoned bride to something far more dangerous. 3 days before Adrian returned and found out exactly what kind of woman he'd married. The sun climbed higher. Gold light spilled across the palace rooftops. In the streets below, merchants were opening shops, farmers bringing goods to market, life continuing as it always did, the great machine of empire grinding forward regardless of whose hearts got crushed in its gears. Elara turned from the window as a knock sounded at the door. "Enter," she called. Lady Margot stepped inside, her face carefully neutral. She took in Elara still in her wedding gown, the unmade bed, the room that showed no signs of what a wedding night should have contained. Your Majesty, she said, shall I help you dress for the day? The title landed like a weapon. Your Majesty. Not because Elara had earned it, because she'd been purchased for it. Yes, Elara said. Her voice came out steady, calm, the voice of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. And Lady Margot, I will need information about the palace, the court, the people who truly run things here. Margot's eyebrows rose fractionally. That is not typically something a new queen concerns herself with immediately. I am not a typical queen. The two women looked at each other across the room. Margot's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes. Calculation? Reassessment. The look of someone realizing they'd underestimated the person in front of them. Very well, Your Majesty, Margot said slowly. I will arrange for briefings. Discreetly. Good. Elara moved toward the dressing area. And Lady Margot, I want to know everything about Celine Vire. The silence that followed was profound. Elara could feel Margot's shock even without turning around, could practically hear the woman's mind racing through implications, through danger, through the realization that this new queen was not going to be silent or convenient or easily managed. That, Margot said carefully, is a name that should not be spoken in this palace. Yet, I have spoken it. Elara turned to face her. And you will find out everything there is to know. Who she is, where she came from, why the king keeps her, and most importantly, how she can be removed. Your Majesty. Margot's voice had gone very quiet. What you are suggesting is dangerous. What has been done to me is dangerous. Elara crossed the room until she stood directly in front of the older woman. I was brought here under false pretenses. Married to a man who thinks I will accept humiliation as the cost of wearing a crown. I will not. Either I am queen in truth, with all the power that entails, or I am decoration. And if I am only decoration, then I have nothing to lose by causing problems. Margot stared at her. Elara stared back. The moment stretched between them, brittle as glass. Then Margot smiled. It was small, dangerous. The smile of a woman who'd spent her life navigating palace politics and had just recognized a kindred spirit. I will make inquiries, she said, discreetly. Do that. And Your Majesty. Margot moved toward the door. A word of advice. In this palace, information is currency. But knowing when to spend it is the difference between power and suicide. The king may seem absent, but he has eyes everywhere. Then I will need to be more careful than his eyes are quick. Elara's hands were perfectly steady as she began unlacing her wedding gown. Thank you, Lady Margot. That will be all. Margot left. The door closed. Elara stood alone in the queen's chamber as morning light filled the room, and the weight of what she'd just set in motion settled onto her shoulders. She'd declared war. Not with armies, not with open conflict, but with the oldest weapon in the world. Information turned against its keeper, secrets exposed, hearts laid bare. Adrian thought he could keep his worlds separate. His duty wife and his heart's love, his crown and his conscience. He was wrong, and by the time Elara was finished, the entire empire would know exactly how wrong he'd been. She stepped out of the wedding gown and let it pool on the floor like a shed skin. The woman who'd worn it last night, the nervous bride who'd thought duty might be enough, was gone. In her place stood something else entirely, a queen with nothing left to lose. And that was the most dangerous thing in any kingdom. The palace woke in layers. First the scullery maids and kitchen staff, stoking fires before dawn turned the sky gray. Then the house guards changing shifts, boots echoing through stone corridors. Then the minor nobles and functionaries who orbited the throne, like planets desperate to catch the sun's attention. By the time full morning arrived, the great machine of empire was already grinding forward, and Elara stood at its center feeling like a gear that didn't quite fit. Lady Margot had dressed her in deep burgundy silk. Queen's colors, she'd explained, though not the full regalia. That would come at the coronation. For now, Elara looked the part without claiming the power. Another careful calculation in a palace built on them. The dress felt like armor, heavy, constricting. Elara wore it anyway. She'd slept 2 hours after Margot left, not because she was tired, because she needed her mind sharp and exhaustion made people sloppy. When she'd woken, servants had brought breakfast on silver trays, fruits and pastries and cold meats arranged like art. She'd eaten mechanically, fuel for what was coming, while her mind mapped the terrain ahead. 3 days until the coronation. 2 weeks until Adrian returned. In that span, she needed to understand this place. The real palace, not the pretty facade they showed visiting dignitaries. The one where power actually lived and secrets got traded like currency. Margot had arranged the first briefing for mid-morning. Until then, Elara had decided to explore. She started in the corridors outside the royal wing. Wide hallways lined with portraits of dead kings and conquered territories. The art of empire. Everyone who'd been broken to build this place, their defeats immortalized in oil and gold leaf. Elara studied each one, looked for patterns, for weaknesses in how previous rulers had held power. Most of them had died badly. That was the thing about empires. They devoured their builders. Adrian's own father had lasted 6 years on the throne before a border skirmish turned into a full war, and he'd taken an arrow through the throat during what should have been a routine inspection of the eastern garrison. Adrian had been 19, barely old enough to rule, thrust into power while his father's blood was still wet on the throne room floor. No wonder he'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate duty from desire. When your crown came soaked in your father's death, you probably stopped expecting happiness to be part of the arrangement, but understanding didn't mean forgiving, and it definitely didn't mean accepting. Elara turned a corner and found herself in a gallery overlooking the palace's central courtyard. Below, servants moved like ants, carrying supplies, tending gardens, maintaining the appearance of order. She watched them for a long moment. All those people, their entire lives built around serving a family they'd never eat dinner with. The invisible foundation that held up the visible throne. Your Majesty. Elara turned. A young woman stood a few feet away, dressed in the pale blue that marked junior court attendants. She couldn't have been more than 16, with nervous hands and a curtsy that went too deep. Yes, I am sorry to disturb you, the girl's voice trembled. But Lady Margot sent me to inform you that Lord Castor has requested an audience. He says it is urgent. Lord Castor. Elara pulled the name from her memory of the wedding feast. Adrian's chief military advisor. A man in his 50s with steel gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the palace walls. He'd sat 3 seats down from the king's table, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. Where? Elara asked. The small receiving room in the east wing, Your Majesty. He awaits your convenience. Convenient was the last thing this probably was. But queens didn't refuse their husbands' advisors, not unless they wanted to start wars before breakfast. Lead the way. The receiving room was smaller than its name suggested, but still grand enough to remind visitors they were in a palace. Dark wood panels, heavy furniture, a fireplace large enough to roast a pig. Castor stood by the window when Elara entered, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him in the posture of a man used to command. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Your Majesty, his bow was precise. Military, nothing wasted. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Elara moved to one of the chairs but didn't sit. A small power play. Make him ask or make him stand. See which mattered more. What is so urgent, it could not wait for proper channels, Lord Castor. Castor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. Or recognition that she wasn't going to play the meek bride. I wanted to speak with you before the formal briefings begin. His voice was gravelly, worn from years of shouting orders across battlefields. To offer perspective on His Majesty's obligations. Obligations. Interesting word choice. Go on. Castor moved away from the window, closer but not threatening. Just a man trying to bridge distance. The king carries burdens that are not always visible to those outside the war councils. The eastern provinces remain unstable. The northern lords test our borders constantly, and there are elements within the court itself that seek to exploit any sign of weakness. You are saying Adrian's absence last night was necessary. I am saying that a king's duty often conflicts with a king's desires. Castor's gaze was steady, measuring, and that those who stand beside him must understand the difference between personal disappointment and political necessity. So I should accept being abandoned on my wedding night because there are provinces to manage. I did not say you should accept anything, Your Majesty. I said you should understand the context. Elara let the silence sit between them. Castor was good. He delivered his message without quite defending Adrian, without quite criticizing her, walking the line between advisor and ally with the skill of someone who'd survived decades in a palace where the wrong word could end careers. But he'd also just revealed something he probably hadn't meant to, that Adrian's advisors were worried enough to send someone to manage the new queen before she caused problems, which meant they thought she could cause problems, which meant they knew she had leverage. "Tell me about Celine Vire," Elara said. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Castor's face went very still, not shocked, not defensive, just utterly, carefully neutral. The expression of a man who'd just heard a name he'd hoped never to hear from this particular person's mouth. "That is not a subject for court discussion," he said quietly. "And yet I am discussing it. Your Majesty." Castor's voice had gone hard. "There are matters that predate your arrival, matters that are complicated in ways you cannot yet understand. For your own protection, I would advise—" "Do not," Elara cut him off, "advise me about my own protection when I was left locked in a room last night while my husband visited his mistress. Do not speak to me about political necessity when the necessity seems to be maintaining his comfort at the expense of my dignity. And do not mistake my newness to this court for ignorance or weakness." She took a step toward him. Castor didn't back up, but she saw his shoulders stiffen. "I know exactly what Celine Vire is. I know where she lives. I know the king maintains her in a style that suggests she is far more than a memory of his youth. What I do not know is why the court tolerates it, why his advisors enable it, and why I am expected to smile and wave and produce airs while pretending not to notice my husband's heart is elsewhere. Because," Castor said slowly, "the alternative would tear this empire apart." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elara stared at him. Castor stared back. And in that moment, she saw past the advisor to the soldier underneath, the man who'd fought wars and buried friends, and learned that sometimes survival meant accepting ugly compromises. "Explain," she said. Castor moved to the door, checked that it was fully closed. Then he turned back to her, and when he spoke, his voice was lower. Careful. "Celine Vire is not simply the king's mistress. She is the daughter of Marcus Vire, Lord of the Western Territories, a man who controls the empire's largest standing army outside the capital, a man whose loyalty has been questioned more than once during succession disputes. Adrian keeps her to keep her father loyal. Adrian keeps her because he loves her." Castor's bluntness was almost shocking. But yes, the relationship also serves to maintain a delicate alliance. Marcus Vire will not move against a throne his daughter's lover sits on. It is ugly. It is pragmatic. And it has kept the western provinces from open rebellion for 5 years. Elara felt the pieces rearranging in her mind. Not a simple affair. A strategic relationship maintained because breaking it might fracture the empire. Adrian caught between the woman he wanted and the stability he needed to preserve, which made her what? The acceptable wife. The legal heir producer. The ornament hung on his arm while the real alliance lived in a manor house 2 hours away. The rage that rose in her chest was cold, calculated, useful. "So I am decoration," she said. "Purchased to look good at state functions while Celine keeps his bed warm and her father's armies neutral." "You are the queen," Castor said. "That is not decoration. That is power, if you choose to use it. Power without respect is nothing. Then earn respect." The same words Adrian had used, as if respect was something she could conjure from air, while everyone around her conspired to keep her ignorant and compliant. Elara walked to the window, looked out at the courtyard below. All those servants, all that careful order maintained through people knowing their place and keeping their heads down. She'd spent her entire life learning to keep her head down, to be what her father needed, what her house needed, what duty required. She was done with that. "How many people know?" she asked. "About Celine." "Everyone who matters." Castor came to stand beside her, careful to maintain distance. The court does not speak of it openly, but knowledge and speech are different things. And if I were to make it public, force it into the light, you would destabilize the Western alliance, potentially trigger the very conflict the relationship was meant to prevent. And you would make a powerful enemy of Marcus Vire, who does not take kindly to those who humiliate his daughter. Even if his daughter is complicit in humiliating me, politics makes strange ethics, Your Majesty. Elara turned to face him fully. Castor met her gaze without flinching. For a man who'd just delivered what amounted to a threat wrapped in friendly advice, he looked almost sympathetic. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why not let me stumble into disaster on my own? Because I have served 3 kings, watched 2 of them die, and I have learned that the queens who survive are the ones who understand that power in this palace is not given. It is taken, slowly, carefully, but taken nonetheless." He moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "Adrian is a good king, better than his father, better than most who have worn that crown. But he is a man who learned to rule by separating his heart from his duty, by building walls between what he wants and what he can have. If you intend to matter here, you will need to find the cracks in those walls, and you will need to be patient enough to work through them rather than smashing them down. And if patience does not suit me," Castor smiled. It was thin, tired, the expression of someone who'd seen too many bright young things destroy themselves on the rocks of imperial politics. "Then you will be empress for 6 months and dead or exiled within a year. The question is whether you value satisfaction or survival." He left before she could respond. Elara stood alone in the receiving room as morning light crept across the floor. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, with the sheer weight of what she'd just learned. Adrian wasn't just maintaining a mistress. He was maintaining a political alliance through his relationship, which meant ending it wasn't as simple as exposing secrets. It meant navigating the threat of civil war, of Marcus Vire turning his armies against the throne, of destabilizing the very empire she'd just been crowned to help preserve. The elegant cruelty of it made her sick, because this was the trap. Not just for her, for Adrian too. He couldn't marry Celine without legitimizing her father's claim to influence over the throne, couldn't break with her without risking war. So he'd married Elara for legal heirs and political stability, while keeping Celine for whatever scraps of happiness a king was allowed to grab in the dark. And she was supposed to accept it, to smile, to perform her function and be grateful for the crown. Elara walked to the door, her reflection caught in the polished wood panels, burgundy silk and careful braids, and a face that looked calm even though her mind was screaming. She looked like a queen. She felt like a prisoner who'd just realized the bars were made of her own good behavior. The briefing with Margot happened in a small office tucked behind the queen's wing. Maps on the walls, ledgers stacked on shelves. The working space of someone who actually ran things while the nobility took credit. Margot was waiting when Elara arrived. She'd spread documents across the desk, household accounts, staff rosters, court schedules. "Your duties as queen consort are extensive," she began without preamble. "You will oversee the household staff, manage the palace social calendar, represent the crown at charitable functions, host visiting dignitaries, and serve as regent in the king's absence should the need arise." "Busy work?" Elara said, scanning the documents. "Designed to keep me occupied while the real decisions happen elsewhere." Margot's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. Many queens have found satisfaction in these responsibilities. Many queens had no choice but to find satisfaction where they could. Elara sat down across from Margot, met her gaze directly. "Lord Castor visited me this morning." "Did he?" Explained the situation. The Western Alliance. Marcus Vire. The delicate balance Adrian maintains by keeping his daughter close. Margot set down the document she'd been holding, folded her hands on the desk. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone choosing words very carefully. What Lord Castor explained is true. What he likely did not explain is that this arrangement has kept thousands of soldiers from dying in a border war that would have accomplished nothing but filling graveyards. Adrian's relationship with Celine Vire is a sacrifice, not for his comfort, for stability. A sacrifice I was not consulted about before being sold into this marriage. "You were not sold, Your Majesty. You were allied. The distinction seems slim from where I am sitting." Margot leaned back in her chair, studied Elara with eyes that had probably seen a dozen noble daughters come through this palace thinking they could change things. Most of them probably broken within months. Elara was determined not to be most of them. "You want to know about Celine," Margot said. "Not just the political situation. You want to know who she is, what she means to him, whether you can compete." "I want to know what I'm competing against." "You are not competing, Your Majesty. You have already won. You are his wife, his queen, the mother of his future heirs." Celine Vire is a comfort, a memory he refuses to let go. But she will never wear your crown. Small comfort when she wears his heart. Margot's expression softened fractionally. Almost kind. Almost. Hearts are overrated in marriage. Power lasts longer. You sound like my father. I spent 30 years watching queens navigate this court. The ones who lasted were not the ones waiting for love. They were the ones who built their own power base, who learned to use the tools they were given, who understood that a crown is not a prize, it is a weapon. And like any weapon, it only matters if you know how to wield it. She pulled a folder from the stack and pushed it across the desk. Inside was everything Elara had asked for. Reports on Celine Vire, her history, her family, the manor where she lived, financial records showing payments made from crown accounts. Letters, not the personal ones from Adrian's drawer, but official correspondence, receipts, evidence. Elara stared down at the papers, at the careful documentation of her humiliation laid out in ledgers and banknotes. How did you get this so quickly? I have been working in this palace for 3 decades, Your Majesty. I get everything quickly. Elara picked up the top sheet. Read the summary. Celine Vire, age 28, educated in the capital, accomplished in music and languages, never married, living on crown subsidy in a manor outside the city. Father Marcus Vire, Lord of the Western Reach, commander of 12,000 soldiers. Reading between the lines, it painted a picture. A young woman raised as a political pawn just like Elara. Loved by a king who couldn't marry her, trapped in a gilded cage, probably just as angry about her situation as Elara was about hers. Almost enough to feel sympathy. Almost. I want to meet her, Elara said. The silence that followed was deafening. Margot's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, calculation, something that might have been admiration. That would be extraordinarily unwise. Then it is fortunate I am not asking for wisdom. I am asking for an arrangement, Your Majesty. Margot's voice had gone very quiet, very careful. Meeting Celine Vire will not give you what you want. It will only make this situation more painful. I am already in pain. At least this way I will understand what I am hurting for. You do not want to understand. You want to fight. And a fight with Celine is a fight with her father, which is a fight Adrian cannot afford. I am not planning to fight. Elara set the papers down. I am planning to talk, woman to woman, without advisors or politics or men telling us what we are allowed to feel. That conversation does not exist, Your Majesty, not in our world. Then I will invent it. Margot stared at her for a long moment. Elara stared back. The room felt very small suddenly, very quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm when everything goes still and you know violence is coming, but you cannot say exactly when. If I arrange this, Margot said slowly, you will be placing yourself in danger. Marcus Vire's reach extends beyond his territories. If he perceives you as a threat to his daughter's position, he will act, quietly perhaps, but decisively. Good. Let him try. You are brave or foolish. I have not yet decided which. They are often the same thing. Margot almost smiled. Almost. 3 days until your coronation. Adrian will not return until after. If you're going to do something reckless, the window is narrow. Then arrange it for tomorrow. Tomorrow. Margot's eyebrows rose. You do not believe in wasting time. I have wasted enough time already. 23 years being my father's dutiful daughter. 3 months being Adrian's convenient bride. I am done waiting for permission to act. Elara stood. The meeting was over. She'd gotten what she came for, information and an ally who might actually help instead of just managing her. Margot stood as well. At the door, Elara paused. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, Your Majesty. You may end up hating what you learn. I already hate what I know. At least this way, I will hate with clarity. She left Margot to her ledgers and her carefully maintained secrets. The rest of the day passed in the blur of activities designed to keep a new queen occupied. Meetings with household staff, tours of wings she'd never visit, introductions to minor nobles whose names she'd forget before dinner. All of it carefully choreographed to make her feel busy while keeping her away from anything that mattered. Elara smiled through it all, nodded at appropriate moments, asked polite questions, played the part they expected. Inside, she was counting hours until tomorrow. Night fell. Servants brought dinner to her chamber. She ate alone, again, in a room that still smelled faintly of Adrian's cologne and her own wedding night humiliation. The bed remained untouched. She'd had them make up a smaller chamber down the hall where she could actually sleep without staring at that crimson monstrosity. Sleep came in fits. She kept waking to sounds that weren't there. Footsteps in the corridor that turned out to be wind. Voices that were just her own thoughts too loud. Around midnight, she gave up. Lit candles, pulled out the folder Margot had given her, read through everything again. There was a portrait tucked in the back she'd missed earlier. A formal miniature, the kind wealthy families commissioned. Selena Vier stared out from the painted surface, and Elara could see immediately why Adrian loved her. Not just beautiful, warm. The kind of face that suggested gentleness, softness, all the things a king probably craved when his days were filled with war councils and border disputes, and men like Castor giving him pragmatic reasons to sacrifice his own happiness. Elara studied that face for a long time, tried to find hatred in herself, found only exhaustion. Tomorrow she would meet the woman who held her husband's heart. Tomorrow she would look into those gentle eyes and try to understand what she was up against. Tomorrow everything would change. She set the portrait down, blew out the candles, sat in darkness, and listened to the palace breathe around her. Thousands of people sleeping under this roof, all of them tangled in the same web of duty and desire and compromises that made empires possible and lives miserable. Somewhere out there, 2 hours right away, Celine was probably awake too, probably wondering if the new queen knew, probably afraid of what would happen when the truth came out. Good. Let her be afraid. Fear was honest, better than the polite lies everyone else kept telling. Elara lay down on the small bed, closed her eyes, and dreamed of fire consuming a manor house while golden-haired women screamed and kings stood watching, unable to choose between the crown and the heart. She woke before dawn, dressed herself in simpler clothes, traveling garb, dark and practical. If Margot had arranged the meeting, she would need to move quietly. Queens didn't just ride out of palace gates without entourages and explanations, but women could. The note was slipped under her door sometime before sunrise. Just an address. A time. The words "I hope you know what you are doing" written in Margot's precise hand at the bottom. Elara burned it in the fireplace. Then she went to meet her husband's lover. The manor house sat 2 hours from the capital, nestled in countryside that looked deceptively peaceful in early morning light. Rolling hills, ancient oaks, the kind of landscape painters immortalized when they wanted to capture the empire at its most benign. Elara saw none of the beauty. She saw only the structure itself, pale stone, ivy-covered walls, windows that caught the sunrise and threw it back like accusations. This was where Adrian came when duty released him, where his real life lived while she waited in a palace that felt more like a mausoleum with every passing hour. Margot had arranged everything with the efficiency of someone who'd orchestrated far more complicated deceptions. A small carriage, plain clothes, a single guard who understood that silence was the price of his continued employment. They'd left through a servant's gate before the palace fully woke, and now Elara stood outside Celine Vier's home, watching smoke curl from the chimneys and trying to remember why this had seemed like a good idea. Because knowledge is power, she reminded herself. Because understanding your enemy is the first step to defeating them. Because sitting in that palace waiting for men to decide her fate was a slower death than whatever truth waited beyond those doors. The guard stayed with the carriage. Elara approached alone. She'd expected servants, a butler, some kind of household staff to announce her arrival. Instead, the door opened before she could knock, and Celine Vier stood in the entrance, looking nothing like the painted miniature and everything like a woman who'd been expecting this confrontation for days. She was smaller than Elara had imagined, delicate-boned. That golden hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a morning dress of pale blue that should have made her look innocent. Would have, maybe, if her eyes hadn't been so sharp, so measuring. "Your Majesty," Celine said. Her voice was softer than Elara expected, almost gentle. "I wondered when you would come. You knew I would. I know what I would do in your position." Celine stepped back from the doorway. "And I am not foolish enough to think I am more restrained than you." Elara crossed the threshold into enemy territory. The interior was tasteful, comfortable, not ostentatious but clearly funded by someone with resources, Books lined the walls, art hung in careful arrangements. A piano stood in one corner, sheet music scattered across its surface. This was a home. Not a kept woman's gilded cage. An actual home where someone lived and read and made music and probably thought very little about the legal wife being humiliated 2 hours away. Elara's hands curled into fists inside her cloak. Celine led her to a sitting room, offered tea. Elara refused. They sat across from each other in chairs positioned by a fireplace that wasn't lit despite the morning chill. The distance between them felt enormous, felt like nothing at all. For a long moment, neither spoke, just two women staring at each other across the ruins of their shared situation. "You are not what I expected," Celine said finally. "What did you expect? Someone angrier, more brittle, the kind of woman who would have come here to make threats and demand satisfaction." "How do you know I am not here for exactly that? Because you would not have come alone if violence was your intention. And you would not be looking at me like you are trying to solve a puzzle instead of destroy an obstacle." Elara shifted in her chair. The woman was perceptive, dangerous in a different way than Elara had anticipated. Not a simpering mistress waiting for her king to visit, someone with her own intelligence, her own calculations. "Tell me how this started," Elara said. "Not the sanitized version your father's advisors probably spread through court." The truth. Celine's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Pain, maybe, or exhaustion. "We met when we were young, before Adrian was king, before my father controlled enough territory to matter politically. It was simple then, or as simple as anything gets when you're nobility and your every action is watched. You fell in love. We fell into something. Whether it was love or just the illusion of having choice in lives where choice is rare, I am still not certain." Celine stood, walked to the window, looked out at the grounds with the posture of someone who'd stood in that exact spot thousands of times before. When Adrian's father died and he took the crown, everything changed. Suddenly our relationship was not private. It was political. My father saw opportunity. Adrian's advisors saw risk. And we were trapped between wanting each other and knowing that acting on it would tear the empire apart. So he married me instead. So he did his duty. Celine turned from the window, met Elara's gaze with a directness that was almost shocking. "You were chosen because you brought strategic advantage and because you seemed unlikely to demand what he could not give. Love, attention, the parts of himself he had already committed elsewhere." The words landed like blows. Elara felt each one, absorbed them, let them fuel the cold rage building in her chest. "And you," she said quietly, "what did you get out of this arrangement, besides a comfortable house and the privilege of sleeping with another woman's husband?" Celine's face went hard, fast, the gentleness evaporating like morning mist. "I got to survive. I got to avoid being married off to whichever political alliance my father deemed most advantageous. I got to keep the one thing in my life that felt real in a world built entirely on transactions." She moved closer. Not threatening, just closing distance. "You think I am the villain in your story, the other woman who stole your happiness. But you never had happiness to steal. You had an arrangement, a contract, and I was part of the terms whether you knew it or not. I should have been told. Would it have changed anything? Would you have refused the marriage, gone back to your father's estate, and let the Whitmore name collapse into ruin? Or would you have done exactly what you did, accepted the crown, and told yourself you could survive without love because duty demanded it?" Elara had no answer, because Celine was right. Even knowing about this arrangement, she probably would have gone through with the wedding. Her father's debts were real. The border wars were real. The strategic necessity of the alliance was real. But knowing and being blindsided were different wounds. "Does he love you?" Elara asked. "Truly? Or are you just convenient proximity?" Celine's expression softened fractionally, became something almost sad. "He loves what we represent. The life he could have had if birth and duty had not claimed him. Whether that is the same as loving me, I genuinely do not know anymore." She sat back down. Suddenly she looked tired, older than her 28 years. "You want me to give him up, to walk away, to free you from this humiliation. I want to understand what I am fighting. You are fighting the weight of empire, the expectation that powerful men can have everything they want as long as they maintain appearances. You are fighting your own training that taught you to accept scraps and call it dignity. Celine's voice was quiet but steady. And you are fighting the fact that Adrian has learned to love the cage because at least the cage is predictable. Elara leaned forward, elbows on knees. The posture was unladylike. She didn't care. What would you do? If you were me, I would burn it all down. Celine's smile was bitter. But I have less to lose than you do. My father's armies keep me safe from most consequences. You are not as protected. Then help me. The words came out before Elara fully thought them through, but once spoken, she realized they were exactly what she meant. Celine's eyes widened fractionally. Help you. You know Adrian better than anyone. You understand the political landscape. You have spent 5 years navigating this exact situation. If anyone knows how to break this arrangement without triggering a war, it is you. Why would I help you destroy the only thing I have? Because this is destroying you too. Elara gestured at the manor around them. This beautiful prison, this half-life. You are not his wife. You will never be his wife. And every day you spend here is a day you are not building your own life. Celine stared at her. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. 8 bells. The palace would be waking fully now. People would start noticing the new queen was not in her chambers. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Celine said finally. I cannot decide which. They are often the same thing. Someone told me that recently. Wise person. She has her moments. Celine stood, paced. Elara watched her move around the room like a caged thing trying to remember what freedom looked like. If I help you, Celine said slowly, it will cost me everything. My father will disown me. Adrian will hate me. And I will have nothing left but the satisfaction of having made my own choice for once in my life. Is that not enough? Celine laughed. It was sharp, broken, the sound of someone who'd forgotten how to find anything funny. You're asking me to betray the man I have loved for 10 years, to sabotage my own security, to trust that you, a woman I met an hour ago, will somehow navigate the political catastrophe that follows without getting both of us killed. Yes. Celine stopped pacing, turned to face Elara fully. Her expression was strange, calculating and desperate in equal measure. What exactly are you proposing? I am proposing we stop being enemies. Stop fighting over scraps of a man who has proven he will choose duty over either of us when it matters. And instead, we pool our knowledge and find a way to free all 3 of us from this arrangement. Adrian will never agree. Adrian does not get a vote. Not anymore. The words hung in the air between them. Dangerous? Revolutionary. The kind of sentiment that got queens executed for treason. Celine's smile was slow. Dangerous. I think I am beginning to like you, Your Majesty. Call me Elara. We are past titles if we are planning coups. Coups. Celine's laugh was more genuine this time. Is that what we are calling it? What would you call it? Survival, by any means necessary. They sat back down. This time the distance between them felt different. Not enemies, not quite allies, but 2 women who'd just realized they were drowning in the same water and might save each other if they stopped trying to push the other under. Tell me about Marcus, Elara said. Your father, his armies, the Western Alliance, everything. Celine's expression went complicated. Layers of emotion Elara couldn't quite parse. My father is a practical man. He cares about power and legacy and maintaining the Vire name. He has used me as a political tool my entire life. My relationship with Adrian was initially organic, but the moment my father realized it could be leveraged, it stopped being mine and became his strategy. Does he know about the marriage? Of course. He approved it. Encouraged it, even. The room tilted slightly. Elara felt the ground shifting under her understanding of the situation. Why would he want Adrian to marry someone else if he was using your relationship as leverage? Because a king with a mistress is vulnerable. A king with a wife and a mistress is controllable. Celine's voice had gone flat, carefully emotionless. My father has been positioning pieces on this board for years. You were not a threat to his plans. You were part of them. Elara's breath caught. The implications crashed over her like a wave. He wanted Adrian divided, wanted him torn between duty and desire. Because a conflicted king makes mistakes, and a king who makes mistakes can be manipulated or replaced. Celine met Elara's eyes. My father is not loyal to the crown. He is loyal to opportunity, and he has been waiting for Adrian to give him a reason to move his armies toward the capital instead of away from it. This was worse than betrayal. This was conspiracy. Years in the making, and she had walked into it blind, purchased like livestock to serve a purpose she hadn't understood. The rage that filled Elara was arctic, precise, the kind that didn't scream. It calculated. How long? She asked quietly. Have you known your father was planning treason? Celine looked away, stared at the cold fireplace. Long enough that I should have warned someone. Not long enough that I had proof anyone would believe. But you suspected. I suspected. And I did nothing. Because warning Adrian meant losing him. And I am not noble enough to sacrifice love for empire. The honesty was brutal, painful, exactly what Elara needed to hear. You are telling me now. Because you asked. And because I am tired. Celine's voice cracked slightly. I am so tired of being a weapon in my father's hands. Of pretending this arrangement is sustainable. Of watching Adrian tear himself apart trying to balance obligations that were designed to be unbalanceable. She turned back to Elara. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. If you can find a way out of this that does not end in war or my father seizing the throne, I will help you. But I do not know what that path looks like, and I do not think it exists. Then we invent it. How? Elara stood, started pacing herself. Her mind was racing through possibilities. Through the pieces of information she'd gathered, through the palace politics and the advisors and the military structures. And then she saw it. The shape of the solution, ugly, dangerous, requiring sacrifice from everyone involved, but possible. We expose your father before he can move, Elara said. We force his hand publicly, reveal the conspiracy, and we do it in a way that makes Adrian the hero and us the loyal supporters who uncovered the plot. My father has protected himself too well. There is no proof. Then we create proof. Celine's expression went sharp. You're talking about fabricating evidence of treason. I am talking about revealing truth that your father has been careful to hide. We know the conspiracy is real. We just need to make it visible before he is ready to act. And how do you propose we do that? Elara stopped pacing, looked directly at Celine. You go to your father, tell him you have convinced me to support Adrian divorcing me and marrying you instead. That I am weak, heartbroken, willing to step aside if it means escaping this humiliation. Celine's face went pale. He will never believe that. He will if you sell it properly. If you give him exactly what he has been waiting for, confirmation that the new queen is breaking, that Adrian's marriage is unstable, that the time to move is now. And then what? Then he reveals his plans, shows you his strategies, brings you into his confidence because he thinks you are finally useful to him again. And I betray him. Celine's voice was hollow. You are asking me to destroy my own father. I am asking you to choose between your father's ambition and thousands of lives, between loyalty to a man who has used you as a tool and freedom to build your own future. The silence was deafening. Celine stood frozen in the middle of the room. Her face was a mask of competing emotions, grief and rage and fear, and something that might have been relief. If I do this, she said slowly, I can never go back. My father will consider me dead. The Western lords will call me traitor. I will have nothing. You will have your life, your choice, and possibly a queen who owes you a debt that can be repaid in land and title once this is over. You are offering me a bribe. I am offering you a future that is not controlled by men who see you as currency. Celine laughed again, that broken sound. But this time there was something else in it, something almost hopeful. You are dangerous, she said. Far more dangerous than anyone in that palace realizes. Good. Elara moved toward the door. I will need every bit of that danger in the days ahead. Can I count on you or not? Celine took a long breath, let it out slowly. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Yes. But if this fails, we both die. You understand that? I understand that doing nothing also kills us, just slower, more quietly. Elara opened the door. The morning had fully arrived, sun painting the countryside in shades of gold that mocked the ugliness of what they'd just planned. I will send word through Margot about the next steps. Until then, you must act normally. Continue your routine. Do not give your father any reason to suspect you are working against him. How long do we have? Weeks. Maybe less. Your father is waiting for the coronation. He wants to see if Adrian's marriage stabilizes or crumbles. We need to move before he does. Celine nodded. Elara could see the fear in her eyes, the understanding that they'd just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Why are you doing this? Celine asked quietly. You could just divorce Adrian, walk away, let the empire burn and save yourself. Because I am tired of powerful men deciding what my life should be. And because the empire burning means thousands of innocent people suffering while lords play their games. Elara met her gaze. I did not ask for this crown, but now that I have it, I will not let it be taken by a man who thinks daughters are disposable. Understanding passed between them. Two women who'd been used their entire lives finally deciding to use themselves, for their own purposes, on their own terms. Elara left without another word. The ride back to the palace was silent. The guard asked no questions. Margot had chosen well. Elara stared out the carriage window at countryside rolling past and tried to process what she'd just done. She'd made an alliance with her husband's mistress, planned to expose a conspiracy she had no concrete proof of, put herself in the path of a man who commanded armies and viewed human life as expendable. Any sane person would call this suicide, but sanity was a luxury queens couldn't afford. They reached the palace before noon. Elara slipped back through the servants' entrance, changed into proper court dress, appeared in the great hall for the afternoon audiences as if she'd been there all morning. No one questioned her absence. No one looked at her differently. She was still just the new queen, the decoration, the afterthought in a story that revolved around her husband. Let them think that. By the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late. That night, Margot came to Elara's chambers after the palace had settled into sleep. She carried no documents, no visible evidence of her visit, just her sharp eyes and her sharper mind. You met with her, Margot said without preamble. I did, and we are going to destroy Marcus Vire before he can move against the throne. Margot's expression didn't change, but Elara saw her grip tighten on the edge of her sleeve, the only sign of surprise the woman ever showed. That is an ambitious plan for someone who has been queen for 3 days. I have been taught my entire life to be ambitious. I am just finally aiming that ambition at something that matters. Does Celine understand the cost? She understands she has no future if we do not act, that her father will use her until she is no longer convenient and then discard her, that she is as trapped as I am, just in a different cage. Margot moved to the window, looked out at the city below. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. I have served this palace for 30 years. I have watched queens come and go. Some were broken within months. Some lasted years before the pressure crushed them. None of them ever fought back. Not like this. Perhaps that is why they failed. Perhaps. Margot turned from the window. Or perhaps you are about to learn why they chose survival over resistance. If survival means living as decoration, I would rather die trying something different. You may get that wish sooner than you expect. Marcus Vire is not a man who forgives interference. And if he suspects what you are planning, then we must ensure he does not suspect until it is too late. Elara joined Margot at the window. The city sprawled below them, thousands of lives. Thousands of people who would suffer if Marcus Vire succeeded in destabilizing the throne, who would die in the wars that followed. She had not asked for this responsibility, but it was hers now, heavy as the crown she hadn't yet officially worn. I need you to do something for me, Elara said, something that cannot be traced back to the palace. Margot's smile was thin, dangerous. I am very good at things that cannot be traced. I need proof of Marcus Vire's conspiracy. Real evidence, letters, financial records, anything that shows he has been planning to move against Adrian. That evidence does not exist, not in forms we can access. Vire is too careful, then we manufacture it. Your Majesty. Margot's voice went very quiet. You are suggesting treason. I am suggesting we expose treason before it happens. The method is less important than the result. You understand what you are asking me to risk. I understand I am asking you to choose between following the rules that protect traitors and breaking them to save an empire. Elara held Margot's gaze. You told me that queens who survive are the ones who take power slowly, carefully. But we do not have time for slow. And I cannot be careful when my husband's kingdom is about to be torn apart by a man who has spent years positioning his daughter as the crack in the foundation. Margot stared at her for a long moment, calculations running behind her eyes, weighing loyalty against survival, tradition against necessity. "If I do this," she said finally, "and it fails, I will be executed alongside you." "Then we had better not fail." The older woman's smile widened fractionally. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" "Myself, 40 years ago. Before I learned that the world breaks women who fight too hard." "Did the world break you?" "No, but it came close." Margot moved toward the door. "I will see what can be found, or created. But Your Majesty, understand this. Once we start down this path, there is no turning back. You will have made enemies of people who can destroy you in ways that make death look merciful. I am already destroyed. This is just choosing how I burn." Margot left. The door closed. Elara stood alone in her chamber as midnight approached and the palace settled into the quiet rhythms of sleep. She had 2 days until the coronation, maybe less before Marcus Vire made his move. In that span, she needed to gather evidence, convince Adrian of the threat, and neutralize a conspiracy that had been years in development. Impossible odds. Suicidal planning. But the alternative was accepting that her life would be spent as a pawn in games played by men who valued power over people, who saw her crown as decorative, who thought she would sit quiet and grateful while they destroyed each other and everyone caught between. She had been raised to be obedient, dutiful. The perfect daughter who asked no questions and caused no problems. That woman had died on her wedding night when her husband chose someone else. What stood in her place was something different, something angrier, something that understood that power was not given to women who waited for permission. It was taken. By force, by cunning, by refusing to accept that the world as it was could not be changed. Elara moved to her writing desk, pulled out paper, began drafting a message to Celine. Instructions, timelines, the careful choreography of a trap that would either save them all or kill them. Her hand was steady, her mind clear. For the first time since arriving at this palace, she felt like herself. Not the performed version, the real one. The woman who had survived her father's brutal household by being smarter than he was cruel. Who had learned to read people's weaknesses and exploit them. Who had been told her entire life that women were not capable of the kind of ruthlessness required for real power. She was about to prove them wrong. The letter finished, Elara sealed it with plain wax. No royal insignia. Nothing that could be traced. She would give it to Margot in the morning to send through whatever network of contacts the woman maintained. Then she went to bed. Sleep came easier than it had in days, because she finally had a plan, had direction, had purpose beyond sitting in a room waiting for men to decide her fate. Tomorrow the real work began. Tomorrow she stopped being a queen in name only. Tomorrow she became dangerous. The coronation came faster than Elara expected. 2 days collapsed into hours of preparation, seamstresses adjusting ceremonial robes, advisors drilling protocol into her skull, servants arranging the throne room like they were preparing for war instead of a ceremony. Maybe they were. Maybe every public display of power in this empire was just another battlefield wearing silk and crown jewels. Elara stood in the preparation chamber while 3 women tightened her corset until breathing became a conscious effort. The gown was white and gold, heavy enough to remind her with every step that queens didn't move freely. They processed, they performed, they carried the weight of expectation on their shoulders and smiled while it crushed them. Through the narrow window, she could see crowds gathering in the palace courtyard. Nobles in their finest, common folk permitted entry for the spectacle. Everyone wanting to witness the moment a Whitmore daughter became queen consort. Everyone thinking they understood what they were watching. None of them knew about Celine's letter that had arrived this morning. 3 words in careful script. He is ready. Marcus Vire had taken the bait. Celine had gone to her father with the story Elara had crafted. That the new queen was weak, heartbroken, willing to step aside if it meant escaping humiliation. That Adrian's marriage was fracturing before it had even solidified. That the time to move was now, while the king was distracted and the court was focused on ceremony instead of security. And Marcus, who had spent 5 years positioning pieces on this board, had finally shown his hand. Celine's letter contained details. names of lords he'd contacted, plans for moving troops under the guise of attending the coronation, schedules for when key loyalists would be in position. Everything Elara needed to prove conspiracy. The question was whether she'd have time to use it before Marcus struck first. "Your Majesty." Margot appeared in the doorway. Her face was carefully neutral, but Elara had learned to read the tension in her shoulders. "It is time." One of the seamstresses made a final adjustment to Elara's train. Another pinned the temporary coronet into her braided hair. She'd received the actual crown during the ceremony. Everything precise. Everything choreographed. A performance designed to make power look inevitable instead of precarious. Elara took a breath. The corset protested. She ignored it. "Is Adrian here? He arrived an hour ago." Margot's voice was carefully even. "He has been in conference with Lord Castor and the military council." "Does he know?" "About the letter. About Marcus. About the trap they were setting while the Empire watched them smile and exchange vows of loyalty." "Not yet." Margot stepped closer, lowered her voice. "Your Majesty, are you certain about this? Once you make these accusations public, there is no retreat. If the evidence is not sufficient, it will be sufficient. It has to be. Faith is not strategy. Then it is fortunate I have both." Margot's expression softened fractionally. "You have grown dangerous in the span of days. I am not certain whether to be impressed or terrified." "Be both." Elara moved toward the door. "It is what I am." The processional route from the preparation chambers to the throne room took 10 minutes at the ceremonial pace required. Elara walked alone, as tradition demanded. Behind her, the train of her gown whispered against marble floors. Around her, palace guards stood at attention, their faces blank as statues. Ahead, the throne room doors stood open, and beyond them she could hear the assembled court rising to their feet. This was the moment she was supposed to feel powerful, supposed to feel like she'd arrived at the pinnacle of what a woman could achieve in this world. Queen consort, royal bride, mother of future heirs. Instead, she felt like she was walking toward an execution. Her own or someone else's, she hadn't yet determined. The throne room was packed. Every noble house in the Empire had sent representatives. The Western lords were there. Elara spotted them immediately, clustered near the front, their positions carefully calculated to show strength. Marcus Vire stood among them, tall and steel-haired and radiating the kind of confidence that came from knowing you held armies in your pocket. He watched her enter with eyes that assessed rather than admired. Weighing, measuring, looking for weakness he could exploit. Elara looked back at him and let him see nothing but the performance he expected. The nervous bride, the overwhelmed girl, the decoration who didn't understand the game being played around her. Let him think that. Let him feel secure. Adrian stood before the throne, dressed in full royal regalia, black and gold, the crown of state. He looked every inch a king, powerful, untouchable, carved from the same unforgiving stone as his ancestors. When Elara reached him, he extended his hand without meeting her eyes. Professional distance, maintained even now. Maybe especially now, with the entire court watching. Elara took his hand. His grip was firm, cold, nothing personal in the touch, just duty executing itself. The ceremony began. A high priest Elara didn't know, and would forget immediately, started reciting the traditional vows, words about loyalty and service and sacrifice, about the sacred duty of the crown and the blessed responsibility of queens. All of it polished smooth from centuries of use until the meaning had worn away and only ritual remained. Elara repeated the phrases she'd memorized. Adrian responded with his own. They moved through the choreography like dancers who'd practiced the steps but never learned to feel the music. When the moment came for the crown, Adrian lifted it from the velvet cushion beside the throne. Heavy platinum. Sapphires that matched the ones in the collar she'd worn at her wedding. He placed it on her head with the same careful precision he probably used when signing execution orders. The weight settled onto her skull, pressed down, reminded her that power was always a burden before it was a weapon. The court erupted in applause, controlled, appropriate, the sound of people celebrating a foregone conclusion. Elara stood beside Adrian and looked out at the assembled nobility, at Marcus Vire, watching her with calculating eyes, at Castor standing rigid near the military advisors, at Margot positioned in the shadows where she did her best work, and she made her decision. This moment. Now. Before Marcus could move, before the conspiracy could unfold on his terms instead of hers. The applause died down. Adrian was supposed to speak next, a short address about unity and the future, standard ceremonial fodder. Elara could feel him shifting beside her, preparing to deliver words someone else had written. She stepped forward instead. The movement was small, but in a ceremony this carefully orchestrated, any deviation was earthquake scale. The room went silent. Adrian's hand twitched toward her arm, a reflex to pull her back, but he stopped himself. Couldn't physically restrain his queen in front of the entire court. Elara kept her voice steady, projected it the way she'd been trained. My lords and ladies, I am honored by your presence today, honored to stand before you as queen consort. But I cannot in good conscience accept these vows without first addressing a matter that threatens the very stability we celebrate. The silence deepened, became something alive and dangerous. She could feel Adrian's shock radiating off him, could see Margot's face go pale in her peripheral vision, could watch Marcus Veyer's expression shift from boredom to sharp attention. There are those in this room, Elara continued, who do not share our vision of unity, who have worked in shadows to undermine the crown they pretend to serve, who have used proximity to power as cover for treason. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Shock, confusion, the rustle of nobility realizing the ceremony had just become something else entirely. Adrian found his voice. His hand closed on her wrist, not violent, but firm. Your Majesty, this is neither the time nor the place. It is exactly the time and place. Elara pulled her wrist free, met his eyes, saw fury there, and beneath it, fear. She turned back to the court. Lord Marcus Veyer, step forward. The room erupted. Not applause this time, chaos, voices overlapping, guards shifting, uncertain whether to intervene. Marcus himself standing frozen in the crowd, his face a mask of disbelief, understanding what powerful people never truly grasp until it's too late. That someone weaker, someone dismissed, someone underestimated can still destroy you if they're willing to burn alongside you. Elara raised her voice over the noise. I have evidence, letters, financial records, testimony from sources close to your household, all of it documenting your conspiracy to destabilize this throne, to use your daughter as a wedge, to position your armies for a strike at the moment you deemed the crown most vulnerable. Marcus's shock transformed into something colder, more dangerous. His hand moved toward his sword, not to draw it, not yet, but a clear threat. You accuse me of treason. His voice cut through the chaos. On the day of your coronation, without trial, without proof. This is insanity. Elara gestured to Margot. The older woman moved forward from the shadows carrying a wooden case. She opened it on the steps below the throne. Inside were documents, correspondence, everything Celine had provided, everything Margot had verified or carefully created to fill the gaps. Your own words convict you. Elara's voice was ice. Your plans, your communications with lords you believed loyal to your cause. All of it preserved, all of it damning. This is fabrication. Marcus's voice rose. Political theater designed to discredit me. I demand the right to... You demand nothing. Adrian's voice cracked like a whip. He'd moved to stand beside Elara, his shock transforming into the kind of cold fury that made men kings. If these accusations are true, you will be tried and executed. If they are false, whoever brought them will face the same fate. He looked at Elara when he said it. The message clear. She had just staked both their lives on evidence that couldn't afford to be questioned. The throne room doors burst open. More guards, not palace security. Western soldiers, Marcus's men who'd been positioned throughout the crowd. The conspiracy revealing itself in real time because Marcus had no choice now but to show his hand or be destroyed. Castor was already moving, the old soldier's instincts overriding ceremony. He barked orders. Palace guards drew weapons. The throne room that had been celebration transformed into battlefield in the span of heartbeats. And in the center of it all, Elara stood beside Adrian wearing a crown that suddenly felt less like burden and more like target. This is what power actually looked like. Not ceremonies, not vows, just people with weapons deciding who got to keep breathing. Marcus pushed through the crowd toward the throne. His men followed. Not enough to seize the palace. This was improvisation, not the full assault he'd been planning. but enough to create chaos, to grab the king and queen as hostages, to turn ceremony into leverage. Adrian shoved Elara behind him, drew his own sword, ceremonial but still sharp, the kind of weapon that made a point even if it rarely saw real use. "You have made a catastrophic mistake," Marcus snarled. "You think these papers prove anything? Half the Western lords stand with me. Your crown sits on a foundation of sand, and one strong wind will—" "The wind you were planning!" Elara stepped out from behind Adrian, spoke directly to the assembled court over the rising chaos. "The troops you positioned outside the city under guise of honoring the coronation. The signals you arranged with lords you believed loyal. All of it is known. All of it has been countered." She was lying. Partially. They'd verified some of Marcus's plans through Celine. But Elara had no way of knowing how many soldiers he had in position, how many lords were truly compromised. She was gambling that Marcus's own paranoia would make him overestimate what they knew. The gamble paid off. She saw it in his face, the flicker of doubt, the calculation of a man realizing his careful plans had leaked, wondering how much, wondering who'd betrayed him. His eyes found someone in the crowd, locked on. Elara followed his gaze. Celine stood near the back. She'd come despite the danger, despite knowing her father would be watching. She wore simple dress, no jewelry, nothing to mark her as anyone important. But Marcus knew, saw the truth written in his daughter's face, the guilt, the resolution, the understanding that she'd chosen a different side. "You!" The word came out of Marcus like poison, like 30 years of investment crumbling. "You gave them—" "I gave them nothing you had not already taken from me." Celine's voice was steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "You spent my entire life treating me as currency, as a tool, as something to be used for your ambition. I am done being used." Marcus moved toward her. Guards blocked his path, palace guards loyal to the crown. The Western soldiers were drawing weapons. The throne room had become a powder keg waiting for someone to light the match. Adrian was shouting orders. Castor was positioning forces. The nobility was scrambling for exits while trying to maintain dignity. Everything fragmenting into violence. And Elara understood with sudden clarity that this moment would define everything. Not just her reign, not just Adrian's stability, but whether the empire continued or fractured into civil war. She made a choice that would have horrified her father, that violated every lesson she'd learned about survival through submission. She stepped forward, put herself between Adrian and Marcus, between the guards and the Western soldiers, between violence and whatever slim chance remained for resolution. Her voice cut through the chaos. Enough. The single word carried weight because it came from someone who shouldn't have had any. From a decoration. From the bride everyone had dismissed. From a woman who was supposed to know her place. "Lord Vire, you have two choices." Elara kept her voice steady, despite her heart trying to punch through her ribs. "Surrender now. Stand trial. Accept the consequences of your actions with whatever dignity remains available to you, or draw weapons in this throne room and ensure that every person here witnesses you as the traitor we have named you." Around them, guards held position. Western soldiers hesitated, everyone waiting to see which way Marcus would fall. Because this was the truth about power that Elara had only just learned. It wasn't about strength. It was about being willing to stand in the space between disaster and survival and refuse to move. About making yourself the thing people had to deal with whether they wanted to or not. Marcus's face was thunder, calculation warring with rage. He looked at his soldiers, at Celine, at the evidence spread across the steps, at Adrian standing ready to defend a crown he'd inherited in blood and refused to surrender the same way. Then he looked at Elara. Really looked. Seeing her for the first time as something other than obstacle or pawn. What she saw reflected in his eyes was respect, grudging, furious, but real. "You have no authority here," he said. But the words lacked conviction. "I have the authority you gave me when you tried to destroy me." Elara didn't blink, didn't move, just held his gaze while chaos swirled around them. "I am the weakness you counted on, the broken bride who would crumble under pressure. Instead, I am the woman who burned your conspiracy to ash and stands here offering you mercy you do not deserve." Mercy. Marcus's laugh was bitter. "You call public humiliation mercy. I call living past today mercy. The alternative is dying in this room surrounded by people who will remember you as the traitor who drew weapons at a queen's coronation, who threatened the stability you claim to value, who proved every accusation true by choosing violence over accountability. Silence. Absolute. Everyone in that throne room holding their breath while Marcus Vire decided whether his pride was worth dying for. Elara could see the war in his expression, the calculations, the realization that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd never considered a threat, that his own daughter had chosen against him, that the careful conspiracy he'd built over years had been dismantled in days by a woman who'd been queen for less than a week. He lowered his hand from his sword. The sound of that single motion, palm leaving pommel, was deafening. It meant surrender, meant acceptance, meant everything Elara had gambled on paying off. Palace guards moved forward, surrounded Marcus, disarmed him with professional efficiency. The Western soldiers looked to each other, uncertain without their lord's command. Castor was already isolating them, separating them from the crowd, containing the threat before it could reorganize. Adrian's hand found Elara's shoulder, not possessive, not restraining, just steadying. She could feel him shaking, adrenaline or fury or relief, impossible to tell. The throne room emptied slowly. Nobles escorted out, Western soldiers detained, Marcus taken to whatever cell housed lords accused of treason. The beautiful ceremony degraded into chaos, degraded into cleanup. Within an hour, only Elara and Adrian remained on the dais. Her crown sat crooked from the struggle. His ceremonial robes were askew. They stood in the ruins of what should have been celebration and just breathed. "What have you done?" Adrian's voice was quiet, dangerous. The calm before a storm Elara could feel building. "I saved your throne. You destroyed my carefully maintained alliance, exposed secrets that were meant to stay hidden, risked civil war on the day of your coronation." He turned to face her fully. "And you did it without consulting me, without seeking permission, without asking a man who was too busy maintaining his mistress to notice his empire rotting from within." Elara met his fury with her own. "You kept me ignorant, treated me as decoration while Marcus positioned pieces to destroy you. So yes, I acted without permission, because permission would have required you to acknowledge I was capable of anything beyond producing heirs." Adrian's jaw clenched. "You had no right. I had every right. I am your queen, your wife, the woman you abandoned on our wedding night to visit the daughter of a traitor." Elara's voice rose. "I have earned the right to defend this throne, whether you approve of my methods or not, by allying with Celine, by exposing her father, by putting her in danger. Celine made her own choice, as did I, as you have been making yours for 5 years while the rest of us adapted to the consequences." The words landed like blows. Elara could see them hitting, could see Adrian processing implications, realizing that his carefully separated worlds had just collided with catastrophic force. "She chose you over her own father." Adrian's voice had gone quiet again. "Why?" "Because I offered her what you never could. Freedom, choice, a future that was not controlled by men who viewed her as property. And what did you promise her in exchange? Safety, recognition, a place in this court that is not defined by her relationship to you. You cannot offer that. The nobility will never accept. The nobility just watched me dismantle a conspiracy while you stood silent. They will accept what I make them accept." Adrian stared at her. Really stared. Like he was seeing someone completely different from the nervous bride his advisors had presented months ago. "Who are you?" The question came out raw, uncertain. The voice of a man realizing he'd miscalculated badly. "I am the woman you married." Elara pulled the crown from her head, set it on the throne behind her. "I am the alliance you purchased. I am everything you thought you wanted in a wife. Strategically valuable, politically connected, capable of providing heirs. What I am not is the silent decoration you expected. And if that is a problem, perhaps you should have asked more questions before signing the marriage contract." She moved past him, toward the throne room doors. Adrian caught her arm. "Where are you going?" "To ensure Marcus is properly secured, to check on Celine, to do the work of maintaining this empire, since apparently that responsibility falls to whoever is willing to shoulder it." "Elara." His grip tightened. "Not painful, just desperate. What you did today, the risk you took, was necessary, was right, and was the only option left when everyone else chose comfort over courage. She pulled free, left Adrian standing alone on the dais surrounded by the wreckage of ceremony. The coronation had lasted 40 minutes before transforming into attempted coup. The cleanup would take days. The consequences would ripple through the empire for years. But Elara had achieved what she'd set out to do. She'd proven she was not breakable, not disposable, not convenient. She'd made herself necessary. In the holding cells beneath the palace, Marcus Vire sat in a room designed to contain nobility without quite calling it a dungeon. Elara found him there an hour after the throne room cleared. Guards stood outside, but she'd ordered them to give her privacy. Dangerous. Probably foolish. But she needed this conversation without witnesses. Marcus looked up when she entered. His face was stone, unreadable. The expression of a man who'd been playing power games since before she was born. Come to gloat. His voice was flat, empty. Come to understand. Elara stayed near the door. Escape route closed if this went wrong. Why? Why risk everything on destroying a king who has been relatively stable, who has kept the empire functioning? What did you hope to gain? Power. As if the answer were obvious. Real power. Not the advisory influence I have now, actual control over the throne and territories. For my house. For my legacy. Through your daughter's suffering. My daughter was never meant to suffer. She was meant to be queen. Marcus's face twisted. Adrian loved her. Still loves her. If he had been allowed to marry her instead of being forced into political convenience, he would have legitimized your claim to the throne. Made the Western lords too powerful to check, destabilized the entire balance of regional authority. Elara moved closer, sat across from him even though every instinct screamed danger. You did not want Celine to be happy. You wanted her to be useful. And when Adrian chose duty over love, you decided to punish him by making that duty as destructive as possible. You encouraged him to keep Celine as mistress. You approved his marriage to me, all of it designed to make him weak, divided, vulnerable to manipulation. Marcus said nothing, but she saw the truth in his eyes. The confirmation. What you did not account for, Elara continued, was that Celine would eventually choose herself, that I would refuse to play the role you assigned, that your carefully constructed trap would collapse because the women you dismissed as pawns became players instead. Women. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Is that what this is? Feminine solidarity. You have doomed my daughter by turning her against her own house. She will be outcast, powerless. Everything I built for her destroyed by your pride. Everything you built on her back. Elara leaned forward. Celine did not ask to be your political tool. She fell in love and you weaponized it, used it, turned her happiness into leverage. Do not pretend your ambition was for her benefit, and your actions were selfless. You exposed our conspiracy to save the empire, not to secure your own position as queen. The question hit closer to truth than Elara wanted to acknowledge. Because yes, part of her motivation was survival, self-interest, the refusal to be crushed by a system designed to make women decorative and disposable. But only part. I did it because thousands of people would die in the civil war you were engineering, because your ambition matters less than their lives, and because someone needed to prove that queens could be more than ornamental if they chose to be. Pretty words. Marcus's smile was sharp. We will see if you still believe them when reality catches up. You have made enemies today. Lords who stood with me will not forgive this humiliation, and Adrian will have to decide whether his pride matters more than his empire. He will never forgive you for exposing Celine's role, for putting her in danger. Then perhaps he should have protected her better himself. Elara stood. The conversation was over. She'd learned what she needed, that Marcus's conspiracy had roots deeper than she'd realized, that more lords were compromised, that the danger was far from finished. But she'd also learned something else, something in the way Marcus looked at her despite his fury, despite his defeat. Respect. You're wasted on Adrian, Marcus said as she reached the door. That boy king playing at rule, you have the instincts of someone who actually understands power. Then it is fortunate I am using those instincts to dismantle yours. She left him in his cell. Guards closed the door behind her. The corridor outside was stone and shadow. Elara leaned against the wall for a moment, let herself shake. Let the fear she'd suppressed during the confrontation rise and crest and finally break. She'd just accused a lord of treason in front of the entire court, had gambled the stability of the empire on evidence that was part truth and part careful construction, had made herself the enemy of every Western lord who'd stood with Marcus. She'd won today, but the war was far from over. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Elara straightened, composed herself. Queens didn't show weakness even in empty hallways. Celine emerged from the shadows. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, like someone who just burned down their entire life and was only now understanding the scope of the ashes. Is he... Celine's voice cracked. Is my father alive, contained, awaiting trial? Elara moved toward her. You did the right thing. I betrayed my own blood. You chose survival over loyalty to a man who was using you. There is no shame in that. Celine's laugh was broken. Tell that to the Western lords, to everyone who will call me traitor, to history when it records what I have done. History is written by survivors. Elara took Celine's hands. We are still alive. That means we still get to shape the narrative. They stood together in the corridor beneath the palace. Two women who should have been enemies, who'd been positioned as rivals in a game designed by men, who'd chosen something different. What happens now? Celine's question was small, lost. Now we finish what we started. We root out the Lords Marcus compromised. We secure the throne. We prove that what we built today was not temporary alliance, but actual change. And Adrian, Elara's expression hardened. Adrian will have to decide what kind of king he wants to be. One who maintains comfortable lies or one who faces hard truths. He will hate us. He probably already does. But hate from a man who chose convenience over courage is not something I intend to lose sleep over. They left the dungeons together, emerged into evening light that painted the palace in shades of copper and blood. The city beyond was settling into uneasy night. Tomorrow the rumors would spread. The story of what happened at the coronation, the accusations, the near violence, the queen who'd stood before a traitor lord and refused to blink. Some would call her brave. Some would call her reckless. Most would simply recognize that the rules had changed, that the palace they thought they understood had transformed into something different. Elara stood in that copper light and felt the weight of crown settle differently on her shoulders. Not burden, not decoration, weapon. She'd proven today that she knew how to wield it. Tomorrow she'd prove she could hold it against everyone who'd try to take it away. Somewhere in the palace, Adrian was processing what she'd done, what it meant, how it changed everything between them. Let him process, let him rage, let him realize that the woman he'd dismissed as convenient had just saved his throne while he stood paralyzed by shock. The confrontation was coming, the reckoning between king and queen, between duty and desire, between the man who'd learned to rule by separating his heart from his crown and the woman who'd just proven that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was care enough to fight. But that confrontation would wait until tomorrow. Tonight, Elara had an empire to secure. And she was just getting started. Adrian found her in the archives 3 hours after sunset. Elara had known he would come eventually. Had been waiting for it the way you wait for a storm you can see building on the horizon. Inevitable. Unavoidable. The kind of confrontation that would either break them completely or forge something new from the wreckage. She was reading through records of previous treason trials when she heard his footsteps. Didn't look up. Just kept her eyes on the page detailing how Adrian's grandfather had handled a similar conspiracy 2 generations ago. That king had executed 17 lords and their families, had burned estates to the ground, had made examples so brutal that the empire still whispered about them in cautious voices. Understanding what power really meant when it stopped performing and started surviving. Close the door, Elara said without looking up. Adrian did. The sound of wood settling into frame was final. Absolute. They were alone now in a room full of dead history about to add their own chapter to it. When she finally looked at him, Elara saw exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He'd removed the ceremonial robes, stood in simple clothes that made him look less like a king and more like what he actually was, a man who'd inherited impossible responsibilities too young and had been drowning in them ever since. For a moment, neither spoke. Just two people staring at each other across everything that had happened, everything that couldn't be unsaid or undone. You should have told me. Adrian's voice was raw, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. What you knew, what you planned, you should have asked permission from the man who left me locked in a room on our wedding night. Elara set down the record she'd been reading. Should have consulted the king who was too busy maintaining his mistress to notice his empire rotting. Should have trusted you with information when you had given me no reason to believe you would act on it. I would have handled Marcus. Adrian moved closer. His hands were clenched at his sides, not threatening, just barely containing rage, without public spectacle, without risking what? Your comfortable arrangement, your ability to keep Celine close while maintaining political appearances. Elara stood, faced him across a table covered in documents about men who died for ambitions smaller than Marcus's. You would have tried to negotiate, to find some compromise that let you keep all your careful compartments separate. And while you negotiated, Marcus would have moved his armies into position and struck when you were too conflicted to respond. You cannot know that. I know you better than you think. Elara's voice was quiet, cold. I know you are a man who learned to survive by never fully committing, by keeping pieces of yourself separate so that losing one would not destroy the whole. It is brilliant strategy, until it becomes paralysis. The words hit. She could see them landing in the way Adrian's expression fractured, the way years of careful control started cracking under pressure he'd never learned to handle. You want to talk about paralysis? His voice rose. You want to stand there and judge me for maintaining the alliances that have kept this empire stable? You have been queen for days. I have carried this crown for 6 years. Do not pretend you understand the weight. I understand that weight better than you do. Elara cut him off. Because I carry it without the luxury of compartmentalizing, without the option of hiding parts of myself away when duty becomes uncomfortable. You get to be king and lover, ruler and man. I get to be queen or nothing. There is no middle ground for women in our world. We are everything, or we are decoration. This is not about gender. This is about you risking. Everything I risked was already forfeit the moment you abandoned me on our wedding night. Elara's voice went sharp as broken glass. You want to be angry at me for acting without permission? Fine. Be angry. But understand that you lost the right to demand my obedience when you proved my trust was worthless. Silence. Heavy. Oppressive. The kind that precedes either violence or truth. Adrian turned away, walked to the narrow window that looked out over the palace gardens. Below, torches marked pathways through manicured greenery. Everything orderly. Controlled. The illusion of peace maintained through careful gardening. I never wanted to hurt you, he said finally. His voice was different now, quieter, the anger bleeding into something that sounded almost like grief. The arrangement with Celine, it predates you. It was never meant to be permanent, just until I could find a way to extricate myself without triggering Marcus's ambition or destroying her future. So you married me as the extrication strategy, the acceptable replacement. The woman who would provide heirs and stability while you slowly disentangled yourself from the relationship that actually mattered. It was not that simple. It was exactly that simple. Elara moved to the window beside him, not close enough to touch, just close enough that they could both see the same carefully maintained gardens, the same illusion. You chose duty. I understand that choice. What I do not understand is why you thought I would be content to be the duty you resented while Celine remained the desire you protected. Adrian's reflection in the glass looked haunted. Because I thought if I could just keep the pieces separate, if I could give each part of my life what it needed without them touching, without them destroying each other, I thought I could survive it. And Celine, what did she think? She thought the same, that we could preserve something real in the spaces between obligation, that love could exist on stolen nights and hidden moments. He laughed. It was bitter, self-directed. We were both fools. Were. Past tense. Adrian turned to face her. Because she chose you over me, over her father, over everything we built together. When it mattered, when the choice was between preserving what we had or doing what was right, she picked right. He paused. She picked you. The weight of that settled between them. Because it was true. Celine had betrayed her father, had risked her safety, had chosen alliance with the woman who should have been her enemy, and in doing so, had proven something neither Adrian nor Elara could avoid facing. That love without courage was just another comfortable lie. Another way to avoid hard choices by pretending they didn't exist. "What do you want from me?" Adrian asked. His voice was stripped bare, vulnerable in a way Elara had never heard from him. "Do you want apology? Explanation. Some grand gesture that proves I recognize what I have done. Tell me what you need and I will. I need honesty. Not performance. Not the careful words advisors craft. Just the truth about what you feel and what you want." Adrian stared at her, and Elara could see the war happening behind his eyes. The trained king fighting the exhausted man. The ruler who'd learned never to show weakness battling the human who was drowning in it. When he finally spoke, the words came slow, careful, like he was testing whether truth would actually destroy him. "I love Celine, maybe still do. I do not know anymore if what we had was real or just the illusion of having something that belonged only to us in lives where everything is shared." He moved away from the window, started pacing. "When my father died and I took the crown, I thought I could keep her. Thought love was something I could protect by hiding it away from duty. But duty found it anyway. Duty finds everything. It demands everything. And I learned too late that trying to preserve pieces of myself meant losing all of them." He stopped pacing, looked at Elara directly. "I married you because I needed a queen who would not demand what I could not give. Because I thought strength meant maintaining control, keeping feelings separate from function. I was wrong. About what? About strength." Adrian's smile was broken, exhausted, real. "You proved that today. Real strength is not controlling everything. It is acting when action is necessary, even if it means losing control completely. You risked the entire empire on a gamble that could have triggered civil war. You allied with my mistress, exposed conspiracies I did not want to see, and you did it all without asking permission or waiting for someone to tell you it was safe. That does not answer what you want." "I want to deserve you." The words came out raw. "I want to be the kind of king who does not need to compartmentalize, who can face hard truths without hiding behind careful strategy. I want to stop being afraid of my own capacity to care about something more than I care about maintaining appearances." Elara felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that the man standing in front of her was finally being honest about his failures instead of defending them. That vulnerability was more valuable than any apology. "You cannot become that king overnight," she said. "You cannot undo 6 years of learned behavior because one day went catastrophically wrong. Change like that takes time, takes work, takes being willing to fail and try again." "I know, and I cannot promise I will wait patiently while you figure it out. I cannot go back to being decoration while you process your feelings. If we do this, if we try to build something real from this disaster, it has to be as equals, as partners who trust each other enough to act without requiring permission." Adrian nodded slowly. "What does that look like?" "It looks like you telling me the truth about Marcus, about which lords are compromised, about what intelligence networks you have been maintaining that I do not know about." Elara moved closer. "It looks like me telling you what I learned from Celine, that what Margot has been doing on my behalf, what plans I have for securing the Western territories now that Marcus is removed. You have plans. I am queen. Planning is part of the job description, or it is if you let it be." Something almost like hope flickered in Adrian's expression. "You want to rule beside me. Actually rule. Not just manage household functions. I want to do what I am capable of. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should have married someone less competent." Adrian's laugh was genuine this time, surprised out of him by the sheer audacity. "I married you because your competence was obvious. I just did not expect you to turn it against me quite so quickly. Against the situation. You were just collateral damage." "Fair." He sobered. "What about Celine?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication, with the understanding that 3 people had been tangled in this situation and resolution required addressing all the connections. "What about her?" Elara asked. "She betrayed her father for you. Gave up her house, her safety, her future." Adrian's voice was careful. "What happens to her now?" "She becomes whatever she chooses to become. Under my protection. as part of my household if she wants it, or with land and titles sufficient to build her own life away from court. You would do that, keep her close. After everything. I would, because she chose courage when it mattered, because we are more useful as allies than enemies, and because I will not punish someone for being brave enough to break free of men who viewed her as property, even if that bravery means she remains in my life. Elara met his eyes, held them. Let him see the steel underneath the diplomacy, especially if it means that. Because I am not threatened by a woman who chose right over comfort. I am threatened by lies and compartments and men who think they can keep pieces of their lives separate while expecting their wives to accept scraps. You are extraordinary, Adrian said quietly, and I have been a fool. Yes, but you are learning. That counts for something. The distance between them felt different now. Still there, still real, but bridgeable. The kind of gap that could be crossed if both people were willing to meet in the middle instead of demanding the other come to them. Adrian extended his hand, not commanding, not demanding, just offering. Elara looked at it for a long moment, considered refusing, considered keeping the distance that had protected her through the last brutal days. But protection through isolation was just another kind of prison, another way of letting fear make decisions. She took his hand. His grip was warm, steady, nothing like the cold formality of their wedding. This was connection, actual human contact that acknowledged they were both damaged and both trying and both terrified of failing again. I cannot promise this will work, Adrian said. Cannot promise I will not fall back into old patterns when pressure builds. Cannot guarantee I will always choose right over easy. I cannot promise I will wait patiently when you do. Cannot guarantee I will not act unilaterally if I believe the situation demands it. Cannot assure you that I will ever be the meek wife you might have wanted. Good. His smile was small, genuine. I do not want meek. I want someone strong enough to challenge me when I am wrong. Someone brave enough to act when I am paralyzed. Someone who will stand beside me as partner instead of behind me as support. Then we have a chance. Not much of one, but more than we had yesterday. They stood together in the archives surrounded by records of dead kings and executed traitors. Tomorrow, they would face the Western lords, would navigate trials, would work to repair trust that had been shattered by years of deception. But tonight, for the first time since their wedding, they were actually talking, actually seeing each other as people instead of obstacles or disappointments or tools to be used. It was not forgiveness, not redemption, not even really reconciliation. It was just the beginning of possibility. Adrian released her hand. We should address the court tomorrow. Together. Present unified front. Show that whatever chaos happened today, the crown remains stable. Agreed. And we need to meet with the Western lords who did not side with Marcus. Secure their loyalty before rumors spread about instability. Castor has been working on that. Adrian moved toward the door, paused. You should be part of those conversations. Your instincts about political maneuvering have proven sharper than mine. Elara felt the recognition land. The acknowledgement that she had value beyond ceremonial appearances, that her capabilities were assets instead of threats. I will coordinate with Castor in the morning. Adrian nodded, opened the door, then stopped again, turned back. Thank you for saving my throne. Even though I did not deserve the effort, you are welcome. For what it is worth, I did not do it for you. I did it for the Empire, for the people who would suffer if civil war erupted. I know. That is what makes it meaningful. He left. The door closed. Elara stood alone in the archive, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. The work of actually rebuilding trust and navigating the political catastrophe she had unleashed would take months, maybe years. But tonight, she had proven something crucial. Not to Adrian, not to the court, not to the Western lords or the palace staff or anyone else watching, to herself, that she was capable of more than survival through submission, that the girl who had been raised to be her father's dutiful daughter had transformed into a woman who could stand in the space between disaster and salvation and refuse to move. That crowns were not decorative. They were weapons, and she knew how to wield hers. Elara gathered the records she had been reading, replaced them on shelves where they would wait for the next generation of rulers looking for guidance from the dead. Then she left the archive and walked through corridors lit by torches that painted everything in shades of copper and shadow. The palace was quieter now. The chaos of the coronation turned conspiracy settled into uneasy rest. Guards stood at their posts. Servants moved through their routines. The great machine of empire grinding forward, because it always did regardless of who sat on the throne or what dramas unfolded in its halls. Elara found Celine in the rooms that had been prepared for her. Small chambers in the queen's wing. Not luxurious, but comfortable. Safe. The kind of space that acknowledged Celine's new status. Not mistress, not enemy, but something undefined that they were all still learning to navigate. Celine stood by the window when Elara entered, looking out at the same gardens Adrian had been watching earlier. Maybe everyone in this palace spent too much time staring at carefully maintained illusions instead of facing reality. "How are you?" Elara asked. "Alive." Celine's voice was hollow, which is more than I expected when I woke this morning. "Your father will stand trial. Adrian has promised fairness. Fairness for a man who planned treason." Celine's laugh was broken. "We both know how that ends. Execution, confiscation of lands, destruction of our house. Everything my family built over generations burned because I chose to betray blood. You chose to stop being used. The distinction feels slim when I am standing in rooms provided by my father's enemies, wearing clothes I do not own, watching my entire life collapse." Elara moved to stand beside her at the window. "You could have chosen differently. Could have stayed silent. Let Marcus move forward with his conspiracy. Maybe he would have succeeded. Maybe you would have ended up married to Adrian with the Western territories controlling the throne, and thousands would have died in the wars that followed." Celine turned from the window. "I am not noble enough to claim I betrayed my father purely for altruistic reasons. Mostly I did it because I was tired of being his tool, tired of maintaining a relationship that required me to pretend I was content with stolen moments. Tired of watching Adrian tear himself apart, trying to balance obligations that were designed to be unbalanceable. Those are valid reasons. They are selfish reasons. Selfishness that saves lives is still salvation." Elara met Celine's eyes. "You made an impossible choice. Do not poison it by pretending it was easy or pure. Courage is not the absence of self-interest. It is acting despite it." Celine stared at her, then started crying. Not delicate tears, real sobs that came from somewhere deep. The kind of grief that had been building for years and finally found release. Elara did not try to stop it, just stood beside her while Celine broke. Offered no platitudes, no comfort that would have been lies. Just presence. The acknowledgement that some pain was too big for words, and the only honest response was to witness it. When the crying finally subsided, Celine wiped her face with shaking hands. "I loved him," she said quietly. "I know that complicates everything. I know it makes me the villain in your story. But I loved Adrian, and I think part of me always will. That does not make you a villain. It makes you human. How can you be so calm about this? Your husband loved me. Maybe still does. How can you stand here offering me sanctuary instead of having me thrown out? Because love is not a finite resource." Elara's voice was steady. "And because I refuse to participate in the script that says women must be enemies over men who cannot choose. Adrian's feelings are his to manage. Mine are mine. What matters is how we move forward from here. Forward to what? To whatever we build. You have intelligence, connections, understanding of the Western territories that will be crucial in the coming months. I need advisors who know how to navigate complexity without requiring permission to think. You are offering me a position. I'm offering you a choice. Work with me to stabilize what we just shattered. Help me navigate the politics you understand better than I do. Or take land and title and build your own life away from all this. Either way, you are not decoration. Not anymore." Celine's expression shifted, calculation returning. The sharp mind underneath the grief, recognizing opportunity. "If I stay, if I work with you, Adrian will have to adjust to the reality that the women in his life are not going to compete for his attention, that we have more important things to do than fight over a man who needs to learn that love requires courage, not just desire. You are remarkable. I am practical, and I am done wasting energy on things I cannot control." Elara turned from the window. "Sleep. Tomorrow we face the Western lords together. Show them that their conspiracy failed because women they dismissed as pawns became players. What if they do not accept it? What if they push back? Then we push harder. Simple as that. Elara left Celine to her grief and her choices. Walked back through corridors that were slowly becoming familiar. This palace that had felt like a prison a week ago now felt different. Not home. Not yet. But territory she understood how to navigate. In her chambers, Margot was waiting with reports. Updates on which lords had been detained, which ones had fled, which ones were claiming ignorance of Marcus's conspiracy and demanding to be cleared. "We need to move quickly," Margot said without preamble, "before the Western territories can organize proper resistance. Show strength now or spend years fighting brushfire rebellions." Agreed. "What do you recommend?" "Trials within the month, swift, public. Execute Marcus and 2 or 3 of his closest conspirators. Offer mercy to the rest in exchange for oaths of renewed loyalty, and place Western territories under direct crown supervision until stability is assured." Harsh. Necessary. Margot's expression was iron. "You broke their conspiracy. Now you must break their will to resist. Half measures will be read as weakness." Elara considered. The old her, the daughter who had been raised to accept rather than act, would have hesitated, would have looked for softer options, compromises that avoided brutality. But that girl had died on a wedding night when she learned that mercy unearned was just another word for being used. "Do it. Coordinate with Castor and Adrian. I want trials scheduled, witnesses prepared, evidence presented in ways that make Marcus's guilt undeniable. And Celine is under my protection. Anyone who moves against her answers to me." Margot smiled. Thin, dangerous. "You have learned quickly. I had good teachers. Flattery will not spare you when this goes wrong. Then it is fortunate I do not plan for it to go wrong." Margot left with her instructions. Elara stood alone in chambers that finally felt like they belonged to her. Not Adrian's rooms that she happened to occupy. Her space. Her territory. She pulled off the crown she'd been wearing since the coronation, set it on the dressing table beside the sapphire collar from her wedding. 2 symbols of power that she'd earned through different means. One given, one taken. Both hers now. Sleep came easier than it had in a week. Elara lay in darkness, listening to the palace settle, and thought about everything that had changed. Everything that remained to be done. The trials ahead. The political maneuvering. The slow work of proving that what she'd started was not temporary chaos, but actual transformation. Understanding that revolutions were not single moments of courage. They were the grinding work of days and weeks and months. The refusal to accept old patterns even when new ones felt impossible. She'd started that work, had proven she was capable of it. Tomorrow she would continue. The days that followed blurred together in a cascade of meetings and trials and careful political theater. Marcus Vire stood before the assembled court and heard evidence of his conspiracy laid bare. Letters. Testimony from lords who'd been approached. Financial records showing movement of troops and resources. He did not deny it, did not beg for mercy, just stood with the same stone face he'd worn in the holding cell and accepted his fate with the dignity of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. They executed him at dawn 3 weeks after the coronation. Clean, swift. Adrian's hand on the execution order because kings were required to shoulder that weight personally. Elara stood beside him when it happened. Not because she wanted to watch a man die, because queens who ordered political necessity needed to face its consequences without flinching. Marcus's last words were to Celine, a simple sentence carried across the execution ground by a messenger. "I hope it was worth it." Celine never answered, just stood in the palace watching from a window as her father paid for ambitions that had used her as leverage. Her face was dry, composed, empty of everything except exhaustion. That night, Elara found her in the gardens, the carefully maintained illusions that everyone in this palace seemed drawn to. "How do you bear it?" Celine asked without preamble. "Watching people die for political necessity, making choices that destroy lives in service of stability. How do you carry that weight?" "Poorly." Elara sat beside her on a stone bench. "I tell myself it was necessary, that Marcus would have killed thousands if left unchecked, that justice required his death. And then I lie awake remembering that justice and necessity are just words we use to make brutality acceptable. Does it get easier? I do not know. Ask me in 10 years. They sat together in silence while night deepened around them. Two women who should have been enemies bound by choices that had destroyed one life to save thousands of others. Understanding that power's real cost was not the taking, it was the living with what you'd taken. The Western lords bent knee within 2 months. Some genuinely. Some out of fear. Most out of pragmatic recognition that resistance would cost more than submission. Elara accepted their oaths with Adrian beside her. Presented the unified front they'd promised each other. Showed the empire that whatever chaos had erupted at the coronation, the crown remained stable. Stronger, even. Because now everyone knew that the queen was not decorative, was not silent, was not safe to dismiss. That knowledge changed how people moved around her, how they spoke to her, how they calculated the cost of opposing her. Power, Elara learned, was not about being loved. It was about being considered, about making yourself something that had to be accounted for in every calculation. She'd done that, had carved space for herself in a world designed to make women small. And she'd done it without becoming the thing she'd fought against, without losing the parts of herself that refused to accept that cruelty was the only option. That balance was harder than any battle, took more strength than any single moment of courage, but it was the work, the real work of ruling, of being more than a crown or a title or a name in history books. 6 months after the coronation, Adrian came to her chambers late at night, not the formal visits required by duty, just a man seeking out his wife because he wanted to talk. They sat by the fire and discussed the empire, the western territories stabilizing, the northern lords making noise about trade agreements, the daily grinding work of keeping thousands of people fed and employed and relatively content. Somewhere in that conversation, Adrian's hand found hers, not claiming, just connecting. The touch of someone who'd learned that partnership required actually reaching out instead of expecting the other person to close all distance. Elara took his hand, squeezed once, released it. They were not healed, not reconciled, not even really in love in the way poets wrote about. But they were building something, slowly, carefully, with full understanding that it might not work, that the damage was real, that trust once shattered took years to rebuild. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was more honest than the comfortable lies they'd both been living. Maybe the real strength was not in having all the answers. It was in being willing to sit with questions and keep trying anyway. Outside the window, the city sprawled in darkness broken by scattered lights. Thousands of lives. Thousands of stories, all of them tangled in the same empire that Elara and Adrian were trying to hold together. Not perfectly, not without cost, but with more honesty than most rulers managed. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. Not the crown, not the title, not even the stability they'd fought for. Just the knowledge that they'd faced hard truths instead of hiding from them, that they'd chosen courage over comfort, that they'd proven people could change if they wanted it badly enough. The fire burned low. Adrian stood to leave. "Stay," Elara said, not a command, an invitation. He stayed. They fell asleep in chairs by the dying fire. Not in the marriage bed that had been the site of so much pain. Just two exhausted people who'd survived catastrophe finding rest in proximity. It was not romance, not passion, not even really intimacy. But it was real. And real was more valuable than any performance. Morning came soft through the windows. Elara woke first. Watched Adrian sleep for a moment. His face relaxed in ways it never was when awake, all the weight he carried visible in the lines around his eyes, even in rest. She understood that weight now, carried her own version. They would both carry it until they died or abdicated. That was the cost of the crown they'd chosen to wear. But they would carry it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd learned the hard way that power without trust was just another form of prison. Elara stood, moved to the window. The city was waking, smoke rising from chimneys, people starting their days, the empire grinding forward because it always did. And she was part of that now. Not decoration, not afterthought, not convenient wife performing expected duties. Queen. In truth. In power. In all the ways that mattered. She'd earned it through fire and risk, and refusing to accept that the world as it was could not be changed. And she would keep earning it every day. through choice and action and the slow grinding work of proving that transformation was possible if you were brave enough to attempt it. The sun climbed higher. Adrian woke. They faced the day together. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but together. And that made all the difference.